Welcome back, everyone, and welcome back to State of the Army. Thanks for joining us again. We are now at our expert panel discussion portion of the day. Looking forward to it for some good talk on the future of the Army. But first, a few reminders of the housekeeping. On the right of your screen, you should see a chat box. There you will be able to ask questions of the panelists or chat with each other if you like. Keep it clean, keep it nice, or ask for technical assistance if you need it. I'll be fielding some questions probably at the end of this discussion, but by all means, feel free to submit something along the way that catches your ear, if anything does, and I may want to read it off and jump in. That's how we do questions here. If you missed our last round, we can't jump live to other speakers, so I'll read them as they're presented to me as the moderator here. And a reminder that the event is being recorded and it will be available on demand shortly afterward for you to share as well. So with that, our panel, let me reintroduce them. I mentioned them at the end of our interview. We just finished our exclusive interview with General McConville, Army Chief of Staff, and I'm very pleased to have our panelists today. We have Karen Gibson, who is a very recently retired Lieutenant General. She was the former Deputy Director of National Intelligence and the former J2 Director of Intelligence at Central Command and CJTF-OIR. That's basically Iraq and Syria, and CENTCOM, everything from like Turkey to Pakistan on the border, just something like that. And then we have Ben Hodges, who's been with us before, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, retired Lieutenant General, now Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, coming to us live from across the pond. Thank you, General Ben, for joining us. And last but not least, Tom Karako, the Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a frequent contributor to our Ideas channel at Defense One. He just never fails. He's a great writer and he's got some good ideas, and he's coming in hot today. So we should have a good topic. Everyone, thank you for joining me. So we'll get right to it. We're going to talk a lot of issues for those at home, we're going to talk Europe and Germany and the drawdown in Russia. We're going to talk the transition from these war years to this great power competition and what the Army is doing or should be doing or needs to do. And we'll talk about some of the technical aspects and weapons and buying and budget, everything about it. But first, I think I want to ask our panel their thoughts on some of what we talked about with McConville, which is the general zhuzh in the air right now about the military and America. You know, we're at the end of this crazy summer of COVID, this crazy year of COVID, with all of the protests around the country and the strife, and the military has been a part of it. The Army has been a part of it in some sense, active duty, National Guard. And we're heading into an interesting period, into the final push for the election, where Americans have thoughts about the military, and the president has thoughts, and the military is in the news in a way that we've not seen. And, you know, Army planners have to deal with this. They see it. There might be a new budget. There might be a new president. There might be the same president. There's a lot of uncertainty. I'd like to ask our two retired three-star leaders, you know, you're not in charge now, but if you were, my Lord, what would be most concerning you about what's happening in the, you know, American political sphere right now? Who wants to start? Karen is pointing to General Ben.
I guess I wasn't intending to start, but I think I hit my unmute button, so I will. You know, obviously, I am incredibly proud of my military service. You know, 33 years, which was 29 longer than I originally intended, and I would never have stayed in the Army beyond my 4-year commitment if I hadn't absolutely loved it. You know, truly, I joined the Army. I was going to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, and it turned out there was nothing I would rather be than an American soldier. I'm very proud of my service, my husband's, my father's, my uncle's, my daughter's. And I hope that every other American service member continues to feel proud of their own service, despite things that are sometimes said in the press that could be supporting or disparaging. I think it's critically important that the military remain apolitical. You know, like General Hodges have served with other nations where that is not necessarily the case, where when there is a transition of power, a change of administration, so to speak, that, you know, certain military officers might run from the room to grab their families and go secure their households and the things that are important to them, because in other militaries in some nations, they are not apolitical. And I think the American people, it's very important that they see also that we are in fact apolitical. As a private citizen, I have my own opinions. Sometimes I express them in my hometown newspaper. I never sign it with my rank. They are my opinions as a private citizen. I don't think we give that up when we join the military, but I do think it's critically important that we remain above, remote, and removed from the political fray.
And do you have anything to add or thoughts on this?
Well, Kevin, thank you. This summer has been a great opportunity to reinforce this principle of our oath to the Constitution. And I think General Milley, as the chairman, has worked very hard to help all of us to remind the American public, that's our oath, is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And of course, the president's the commander-in-chief, but the Congress also has very significant constitutional responsibilities. And I think, when Mark Milley publicly talked about the mistake that he made being used as a prop, basically, that was impressive. Some courage and leadership, and acknowledging that, even at the ripe old age of our chairman, that you can still learn and learn from a mistake. I think that we want to continue to do everything possible so that the American people never wonder, hey, what's the Army going to do during the transition? The Army will do what it's done for the last 240 something years. We will continue to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I think that should give people a lot of confidence.
Tom, why don't you do a chance to weigh in if you wanted? I know one thing we were talking about beforehand was just yesterday, the president's comment that essentially the leaders in the Pentagon are, he's got the support of the military, but the leaders in the Pentagon are, just doing the bidding of defense contractors when they start wars. I think most of us here would say that's not exactly how wars are started, or how Pentagon leadership or policy is made, or how the defense industry operates.
Yeah, I think the comments thus far are right on point. The quality of integrity is not strained, and the more that an institution is respected as the military cashes in that cachet for political benefits here and there, everybody's kind of brought down lower. So I was just on a podcast earlier, and it was observed that neither political convention this summer did you see retired general officers taking the presence that they did in 2016, and that's probably for the best. Folks still do things in their private capacity, but drawing that line a little bit is probably a good thing for everybody.
Well, maybe we'll come back to this idea of what, I'm curious to get into the topic of how much the American people really understand the military and its purpose, and especially the Army, but we can thread that in later. Karen, let's get more back to the future of the Army specifically. We all talked ahead of time and had some conversation to get on the same page. And for those of you watching, one of the more interesting points that Karen had mentioned to us was, her focus is I'll let you tell it yourself, but coming out of the transition of being a leader during the Mideast War years, Iraq and Afghanistan, and being at CENTCOM, getting a window through DNI, but as an intelligence leader, looking into the future of what America needs, specifically Army intelligence, to do this great power competition that's been thrust upon us by our policy leaders. Like you said, preparing for China, preparing for Russia is a hell of a lot different than finding high value targets in the sands in the Middle East. So why don't you kick us off from there?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. That's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this important dialogue about the Army's future and how we best prepare to, in fact, continue to fight and win the nation's wars. 33 years, if I could pick one year to relive, because many of them were very satisfying, it would be, 16, 17, 18, our fight against really defeating the ISIS physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. And we could talk about what that took, the great roles performed by, 3 Corps, 18th Airborne Corps, 101st, 1st Infantry Division. But really struck me when I left U.S. Central Command and moved to Washington, D.C. and began to take a more global approach to the problems that we face was that the fight we had won, and of which I was so proud, that method of warfare was really not scalable. That when we contemplate conflict or combat against something other than a large organized violent extremist organization like ISIS, the scale, the speed, the complexity of the fight would vastly exceed what we had just accomplished. And in particular, for me as an intelligence professional, I think about targeting and support to targets, and long-range precision fires is a priority for the Army right now, appropriately so. But in my opinion, about 80% of that is find, fix, and maintain custody of that target so that you can engage it with your weapon systems. The mobility of targets, the geographic scale, the distance. The way in which we fought in Iraq and Syria is not scalable to a conflict with China or Russia or Iran. And so clearly there are some things that we would need to change. And as the chief said in his previous remarks, it's not that we seek to engage in conflict with those nations, but deterring through strength and being prepared to do that. I think aside from the vast scale and scope of those, some other things that we could talk about, which General McConville also mentioned, was the A2AD, the denial of access not only to the air, potentially to our sensors, but we have not encountered an adversary that has truly prevented our access to the air, our access to the electromagnetic spectrum, who has conducted large-scale cyber attacks, or potentially even degraded our ability to use assets from space, which are all critically important to the Army. And then finally, I think those violent extremist organizations, while we have had some very, very tragic deaths in the United States, for instance, the sailors that were killed in Pensacola last year, they could not impact the homeland in a way that a nation state might be able to, whether that's, again, through cyber or through degrading our ability to project power from our power projection platforms in the United States. And so there are a number of things I think that we need to do to prepare for those more complex kinds of conflicts. I think the Army is headed in the right direction. I don't want to take more than my share of time discussing this, but Project Convergence, which they've recently announced, it will be an Army Futures Command sponsored series of exercises and rehearsals that are really designed to bring together sensors, shooters, and command and control in a joint all-domain environment. Another complexity I didn't mention would be the multiple domains in which we'll have to fight. It's no longer just about air, sea, land, cyber, space, and even I would suggest influence or cognition is an area in which we compete every day for how others perceive the world. And so I think these are very important things that the Army is working on. We can perhaps talk a little further in some of the follow-on questions on other ways in which we need to work or make improvements to enable us to fight that kind of high-speed, complex warfare.
Well, you've described a great problem for the Army to tackle. The question, as I guess that I have, is how? What comes first? Other than, sounds like, wow, the U.S. needs a hell of a lot more of everything, and they need it at a massive new scale, and this is going to cost massive amounts of money when we're talking about COVID dividends potentially, and a plummeting, level of American support for wars abroad. What comes first to do this? And if, Ben and Tom, if you want to jump in, feel free. When you speak, the camera will come to you if you want to jump in, or you can raise your hand and I'll make a note.
I appreciate the way you phrased that, Kevin, because I don't think it's a matter of doing things the way we always did, only faster, or doing things that always did, only more. It is not about taking today's technology and applying it to industrial era processes. It's about finding information age processes to deal with the problems that we have and applying the technology in different ways. So one minor example I might give is all of the manpower that is currently wasted staring at videos, full motion video from different ISR platforms. Having machines that do that work, that can not only free up human cognition to work on other things, but to look beyond the scale of just a pair of eyeballs to process that video. Using some of overhead sensors to fuse together to enable us to acquire targets more rapidly. We've got to find less manpower intensive ways of doing that. So really, I think applying a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence or complex computing, different sensor mixes, and back to the kind of industrial complex. Instead of having platform-centric, sensor-centric, even service-specific solutions for things, we need to have a data-centric approach in which data from all of our sensors is coming together, and the fusing and analysis of that is agnostic to the platform, it's agnostic to the sensor or the discipline or the service. In other words, just because it was collected by an Air Force platform doesn't mean it's not soldiers working in a fire direction center somewhere dealing with that. And we've really got to harness technology to find newer ways, different ways of doing this in a less manpower intensive area.
Ben, I think I saw you raise your hand on this.
Yeah, we know two things for sure. The Army is not going to get any bigger, and the defense budget really is not going to get any bigger. So it's just not going to happen, especially in the current environment. So that's why the only way the Army is going to be able to do its job, in fact, the only way the Department of Defense is going to be able to do its job, is by working with allies and partners, because we do not have the capacity to do everything that needs to be done. I'm sure within the next 5 to 6 years, we're going to be in a kinetic conflict with the Chinese. And so most of the intelligence, special forces, Air Force, Navy, these kind of things are going to be focused in the Pacific. So having this strong European pillar is essential. Or if we want to prevent a crisis in the Black Sea region or in the Baltics, you got to be able to get there fast, which means that we're going to have to use host nation harbors, airports, rail, contract vendors. None of this is going to happen without allies, which is why it's so hard to understand why the administration is constantly denigrating the allies and doing things like this announced withdrawal from Germany, which only hurts us because it's going to reduce the enablers that we have that are necessary to help us carry out our tasks, and it reduces the headquarters and the platform. So there's a disconnect there, and I think all the things that Karen says, she's exactly right. We're just not going to get more stuff. We're going to have to rely on allies to do it, and of course, without the Guard and the Reserve, none of this happens either. I mean, the talent and capabilities that are in the reserve component are also going to be an essential part of us carrying out these tasks. And then the last point I would make is if you don't have cyber protection for the port of Bremerhaven, nothing is coming into Europe. A cyber strike shutting these things down is just as bad as some of Tom's missiles flying out of Kaliningrad hitting the port of Bremerhaven. And so we've got to figure out how do we ensure cyber protection of all of our critical transportation infrastructure in Europe as well. So bottom line, we're not getting more money, we're not getting any bigger, so we got to get more out of allies and out of reserve component.
Well, Tom, I think you in on that. Just like you said, no more, not getting bigger, not getting money. Don't feel like all you have to talk about is missiles. We think you're more than that. You think you're more than the missile guy, despite what Ben says. But long range strike and all of what the other two panelists are saying. I keep hearing a mix of we're going to need more AI, we're going to need more data, more sensors, but can't that only do so much?
Sure. I guess I would, first of all, go back to what General McConville said and kind of connect this with some of the things there. Kevin, when you introduced the discussion of long-range strike, he kind of pounced on it because it's their number one priority. So, yes, it's not about just missiles. It's about all the enablers and things that fit together. But at the end of the day, there is a big demand signal on their part, the bad guys, and our part to be able to kinetically reach out and destroy a thing. And so that, I think, is why long-range fires are right at the top. because at the end of the day, it's a new missile age, as frankly the commandant of the Marines pointed out. And so what General Gibson was pointing out there in terms of the let's just call it network fusion, all this kind of stuff. Of course, that is the answer. It has to be the answer. That's the JADC2 kind of thing. That's the latest phrase for it. But if you think you've heard this before, it's because you have. You notice that General McConville used the phrase transformation in his remarks. This vision has always been the vision for the future, going back to future combat systems and all that kind of thing. Details aside, here we are, history has returned, and we're focused like a laser beam on China and the like. And so there's a new urgency to this network centrism. But in a way, that's been the vision for so long, and we just have to get after it so that the kill chains for those long range fires and the concepts for the deployments of them, so as to Karen's point, we make the targeting harder for them so they can't find us. Those are the kind of concepts and innovations that really deserve a lot of attention. And that's why I'm glad you asked General McConville about the Tomahawks and other things that the Marines and now the Army are doing. That's fantastic. You don't need a silver bullet hypersonic doohickey. You can take a off-the-shelf missile right now and deploy it in lots of imaginative ways and drive our adversaries bananas.
Well, I want to ask you about what to do with those missiles, and maybe a question for Ben too. First, I mentioned this to McConville, but I don't expect him to say it. But when you think of the air missile era, it's either has to do with China, or it has to do with Russia, or it has to do with Iran and in the Mideast, to be blunt about it. I guess maybe pick one of these. What are we really trying to defend here, and how much of it? Again, give me a sense of scale of what the United States needs versus what maybe other allies could supplement with this, not growing static pool of money, maybe even decreasing pool of money that we're looking at.
For air defense broadly, you mean?
Sure.
Yeah. So no, I think that's right. I think that in the past we've sometimes treated active air and missile defense as a kind of catcher's mitt, something that is separate from our offensive fires. There are different wings of the schoolhouse at Fort Sill, where one is ADA, air defense artillery, and the other is field artillery. Finding ways to bring those things together, no kidding, in terms of training as well as material and organizations, that's going to be huge. If the Army is serious when they say they want to bring those together and have, let's just say one network for all Army fires, that's the way to get after it. That's closely connected to the kind of the policy question that I think you're leading to there, Kevin, and that is we can't defend everything, so we're always going to have to pick and choose. And as a practical matter, I would suggest that our military forces are be what's going to require a little bit of preference for defense. And so that's a little bit different from, you might say, the atmospherics of the 1990s in terms of population and that sort of things. But if we want active defense and strike to best contribute to deterrence, they need to be put together. And so an adversary knows that they won't succeed in their objectives of decapitating our forces, and we'll be able to follow it up effectively.
Let me ask, Ben, I'm going to ask you, and then Karen ask you about networking, but Germany is the other side of the world where this is, not Germany, Europe, Eastern Europe is another side of the world where missile defense is always on the table. I know you want to talk more about, again, future of the Army, about this Germany pullout. McConville said it's still in the planning phases. He cited Congress saying that it'll take months for them to plan it. It could take years for them to execute it. Boy, that doesn't sound like anybody's really hankering to get out of Germany anytime soon. It almost sounds like the Army's dragging their feet till election day. But what are give us kind of the bluff, the bottom line up front about this Germany pullout. What's really the thing that American people should care about and worry about? And what's the better solution that you think the Army should be considering?
Well, for sure, it is going to take months to plan and years to execute. And I will bet you a glass of sweet tea that what was briefed on the 29th of July will look nothing, or what happens will look nothing like what was briefed on the 29th of July. Just as they go through the staffing procedures, all the work that's required whenever you do stationing decisions. The Congress has a very important role here, not just paying for it, but also members are interested where troops go in their districts and that sort of thing. So honestly, this was clearly a political decision, not based on any strategic analysis, because none of the things that were announced on the 29th of July would have been the logical outcome of a strategic analysis. I mean, if it's about punishing Germany because they're not 2%, but yet Italy and Belgium are the two countries that are going to gain the most permanent station stuff in Europe. Belgium's not even 1%, and Italy is 1.2%. And Italy is the worst country in Europe for training. So the fact that the secretary and the vice chairman, neither one of them even mentioned the word readiness during that entire press conference on the 29th of July was also a stunner for me, because readiness is almost always the first word out, that this is going to improve readiness. And I don't want to go through all the different eaches. The bottom line is that what we're losing, if these things happen, first and foremost is confidence of our allies, that we would make such a big decision that affects NATO, that affects relationships, that we would make a decision without any sort of consultation. The senior army leaders in Brussels and in Stuttgart and in Wiesbaden were caught completely by surprise as well. So we didn't even tell our own guys, let alone the allies. And so this damages these relationships that are so important when there's so much pressure and so many challenges. Maintaining the cohesion of NATO is always got to be job one. So this did not help. Now, I would not accept your comment that, well, the Army's probably dragging their feet until the election. No professional soldier I know would approach it like that. They're pros in the Department of Defense. They're going to do what they're supposed to do. But the fact is, it will take a long time. And the Congress has already said, you're not going to use any 2021 money to do any of this. So I would imagine it will take a long time.
But Tom, I'm seeing notes from you. Chime in here. What are your with your reactions of what you're hearing?
Look, I think General Hodges, of course, is exactly right in terms of we don't want to be doing things like this for political reasons, and there's reason to think it is for political reasons in terms of the tweets and things like that. I guess
it's own words. The president said flat out, this is to get it's punishment to get the Germans to pay. He said it, his words.
I agree. I would say that there is a different conversation that one could have here in terms of, it's not about pulling them out, but it's redistributing them and frankly just distributing them differently. One of the things that the National Defense Strategy talked about so much is distribution and the service concepts. You do a word search on all these things, distributing so as not to make an easy target for the other folks. So obviously the forces in Germany, that's a big fat juicy target. There is, I think, a strategic argument for doing things differently to adapt to the new environment, and frankly, putting some stuff in Poland. I like that a lot. So I think of course, the devil's in the details. We have to wait and see. But I think we ought to be open to some different force structure in Europe than we've had for a while too.
Karen,
Kevin, could I just one intervention on that? Tom's high school GPA was about 3 points higher than mine, so I'm taking risk here, challenging him. But the force structure in Europe is always changing. I mean, remember, it wasn't that long ago that the last tanks went home. During the previous administration, the 2 armor brigades in Europe were sent home because we thought Russia was going to be our partner, and the aviation brigade was used as a bill payer to pay for a lot of other aviation requirements across the Army. So, we're having to bring stuff back because we cut too far already. There's one Patriot battalion in all of Europe, one U.S. Army Patriot battalion for all, and it's going to take that whole battalion just to protect Ramstein. So when you talk about what do we want to protect, it's air bases, Spangdahlem, Ramstein, Aviano, but it's also critical infrastructure, airports and seaports. You can't get from Fort Hood to the front unless you come through an airport and a seaport. So we've got to protect that. And this is where I think our allies could really pick up a much larger share. We're going to have a core headquarters and a division headquarters in Poznan, Poland. Who's protecting, talk about a big fat juicy target. Or the Povitz, where we've created a logistics hub and aviation units flying out of there. Instead of always saying 2%, 2%, 2%, say Germany, we need you and the Dutch. You already have Patriot. We need you to provide for the Baltic region. Poland, you got to cover Poland, Romania. You've got to cover this area. Be specific with a request, and I think these things are more achievable. We have one transportation battalion in Germany, one intelligence battalion, one signal battalion. It's mostly enablers. Very few, small percentage are the combat or the striker brigade. So redistributing those kinds of units is not the same thing as redistributing multiple infantry battalions or artillery battalions.
Well, I mean, hey, Karen, come on. You gotta, I'm gonna ask you to give us the intelligence view of this. What I'm hearing is a lot more of what you said earlier about scalability. Ben just said it. We have one of this battalion, one of that battalion, one of that battalion. This is not the Cold War footing that we had, and yet, by a lot of, writers, we're, headed into this new version of some kind of I won't say Cold War, but you know what I mean. If we've got to do great power competition, we used to have a hell of a lot more things at the ready to do it than we do now. And, sensors and data will get us so far, but as Ben said, it may not take a missile strike from Russia to knock out the port. It'll take a cyber attack. And, give us a sense of whatever you can. Hey, how vulnerable these U.S. interests are. And again, the point is the future of the Army. What needs to be done specifically to be in a better position?
Okay. So you threw a hook there at the end, Kevin. I thought you were going to ask about intel and alliances, and I was going to build on some of the things that General Hodges said.
Please do.
In terms of having lots of stuff, one of the things that we've always had lots of is partners and allies, which is not something that most of our adversaries can claim. North Korea, Iran, China, even Russia, do not have the kind of strong partnerships and alliances that the United States has, or have held the kind of global leadership roles that we have. I can tell you that 6 of the last 8 years of my military service, I had a coalition deputy. I've never fought alone. I don't want to fight alone. Our coalition partners and allies bring critical enablers. Some of the things that General Hodges mentioned, they bring strike capabilities, they bring intelligence, they bring cultural understanding, they bring linguists that we don't have. They bring logistics capabilities, planning, basing, some defense kind of things of those locations where we are located. It's absolutely critical. And I think, some of my thoughts, I'm not an expert on how we should be distributed in Europe. My one European tour was my year in Kabul because I got to work with NATO. So I really don't have the same understanding, excuse me, that General Hodges does. But I would say that as we treat our allies poorly and as we denigrate alliances and relationships, I was still on active duty when this trend began, and I was working hard to establish and sustain strategic relationships with partners in the Middle East. And I thought, how can I look these guys in the eye next time and say, you should trust me, stick with us, we're going to be here for you. There are ways to do these things that are better thought out and take into account some of our alliances. I would also say that as we withdraw from places, and this is an intelligence problem, when we begin to withdraw from locations, we start to lose our insights. We lose our ability to sometimes interact with the local military. We diminish our defense attaché capabilities, and we lose essential understanding on those parts of the world where we've decided that we're no longer going to operate. So I think, unfortunately, some of these things are a bit intangible and hard to put a dollar on when you're trying to present, say, here's how much you owe us for our presence in Korea. For instance, there's a lot that we get in return that is not easily monetized, but should still be considered when we contemplate what kinds of forward presence we want to have and what kind of partnerships and alliances we need to remain strong as a nation.
Well, Ben, another issue that you had mentioned you wanted to talk about, and I'd love to hear about, is Turkey. If we're stick with Europe and NATO for the moment, and about alliances and partnerships and intelligence. I'm sure you can tell us lots about their relationship with our ever-changing relationship with Turkey. We run a lot of think pieces, commentaries that have been quite critical of Erdogan. Recently, there've been a couple that have said, you know what, don't focus on Erdogan. Focus more on what Turkey is doing at a different level. Often in reporting, as a national security reporter, we kind of get that added benefit to get a little bit more reporting and information about the mil-mil relations, the intelligence relations. What can you tell us about the state of the relationship with Turkey? And again, this is a Future of the Army session, but it matters for lots of reasons, and you can explain too. But what's concerning you right now about their relationship?
Well, try and imagine NATO without Turkey. We would be in a difficult position, just from the geography as well as their capability. And even though they are a very, very frustrating ally many times, the fact is they show up for everything. Every exercise, every NATO headquarters, Turkey will fill its positions. You can't say that for every one of the allies. So that needs to be said. Of course, the conflict between Greece and Turkey would be a catastrophe for our alliance. Only the Russians would benefit from having two NATO allies going after each other. Of course, their animosity goes back centuries. In the past, the United States always had a big name, serious diplomat like Holbrooke that would kind of get in the middle there and bang some heads together, and U.S. could kind of help reconcile this. We don't have that right now. The U.S., from the U.S. State Department, they're basically saying, hey, we need Germany to take the lead here, and we'll support them, but Germany has to solve this. Now, I would like to see Germany show some diplomatic muscle and do it, because they are in the EU and they are in NATO, and they probably the only other country that could do this. But I'm not feeling the oomph yet on that happening. Now, look, I think the relationship between the United States and Turkey needs to be reframed. The fact that the boundary between EUCOM and CENTCOM, for example, is also the border between Turkey and Syria. You wouldn't do it if you started off with a blank sheet of paper. You wouldn't have combatant commands on the same border that's caused so many problems. Been so many problems here in the last few years. I think that we're paying a strategic price for giving weapons to YPG, even though that had a tactical benefit for actions against ISIS. Our ally is Turkey, a treaty ally. ISIS is not an existential threat, and yet we made a tactical decision that I think we're going to pay a strategic price. So, time to reframe the relationship, trying to rebuild some trust. I would never excuse Turkey's terrible decision to purchase S-400s. We tried to sell them Patriot, but we were not willing to give them the secret sauce so that they could make their own. But we've got to come up with a way out for the Turks to back away from this bad decision, and not try to get S-400 operational. But we got to figure out a way to protect this relationship. Think beyond Erdogan. What you said at the beginning of your question is exactly right. He's not going to be around forever. But that map is not going to change. The Black Sea is not going to change. And so, I mean, if you think about the Black Sea, without the Black Sea, Russia could not be in Syria. They could not be in Libya, generating millions of refugees that are going into Europe. And this is not a unintended outcome or an accident. This is weaponization of refugees. And so it's to everybody's advantage to fix that relationship with Turkey.
I frankly haven't heard the words S-400 in a long time in the press. It happened. Everyone was freaking out about it. The Turks were going to sidle up with Putin and with their brand new system, and that was the end of it. And that was the end of Turkey and NATO. I don't think it's happened that way, but what have you seen lately?
Oh, some of us haven't forgotten the S-400. I assure you. Look, I think what General Hodges said there is very important. And the Black Sea, and everybody kind of focuses on the Baltics, and justly so. On our relationship with Poland is so important. But it's Southeast Europe, and just look at what Russia's been doing in terms of its, call it, diplomatic and mill and political relationships from the Black Sea to Georgia to Syria, and now with Turkey. So I take the point about Erdogan's not always going to be there, but it could be Erdogan Jr. And what I see is this relationship between Russia and Turkey that is kind of a strategic shift to the south. And if that is not altered soon, it may be difficult to dislodge as a matter of policy over the long term. So I attach a whole lot of importance to the S-400 as a really important episode where I think unfortunately we failed to take a hard enough line with our allies. It's interesting. The administration's taken a hard line with Germany on different things, but for whatever reason, on the S-400 thing, I think we just were insufficiently soft. And I guess my general approach is frankly similar to that. What I think we should have done with Khashoggi, which is you don't pretend it didn't happen. You call them out. You speak truth to power. You say this is not acceptable, and then you continue on with your military cooperation that you have a partnership for. And I think, unfortunately, trying to sublimate and push down just the obvious facts of what's going on here. And I don't think that's for the good.
Well, that's an interesting topic. I think we could talk, at length another time, maybe on changing relations. How do you approach, like you said, Khashoggi, the Saudis? How do you approach the Turks? But it does, Karen. This is my nice transition to bring you into this. I heard you say earlier that why should allies trust the United States if they don't live up to their word? I know you were at CENTCOM. I don't put words in your mouth. My hunch is you may have had Syria in your mind, and with that kind of a statement. At least I do, and I'll say it, for myself. Buy with through is supposed to be the way the United States wins security on the cheap, or at least in a different way compared to the big wars, the big Iraqi wars, right? And that's what Syria was supposed to be. That's what the future of all the counterterrorism, threats and conflicts and needs is supposed to be across the Middle East, across North Africa. A very large part of that falls on the Army. We're in this area of transition. We're talking about great power, but terrorism hasn't gone away. ISIS hasn't gone away. Al Qaeda hasn't gone away. Al Shabaab hasn't gone away. Boko Haram hasn't gone away. Much as you can, as a recently retired, no longer beholden to these certain offices. What are your thoughts of where we are on those conflicts? And again, we're trying to think of the future of the Army and what's needed to stay focused to do those jobs. I mean, again, this is the great power era. There's a lot being asked not suddenly, but there's a lot being asked of the Army going forward. But that's still there.
Sure. So I think, when we say that ISIS is still there, Al Qaeda is still there, but they are not there in the same capacity. I mean, all they have been able to do is inspire attacks by radicalized people, and the scope and scale, the ability to reach out and touch us, or even most European nations, is vastly diminished. I think we've worked closely, particularly on the Arabian Peninsula, say, for instance, with the Emiratis and others, to develop teams locally. Even Iraq, if you look recently, the prime minister said, not sure we really need help anymore to defeat ISIS from the coalition. So building local capacity, I absolutely think by, with, and through is the way to go. It is less expensive for us. It bolsters the chances for longer term stability. I mean, even if you look at the Taliban and Jaroa, the government in Afghanistan is generally trending in a positive direction. I do think that means it requires a light sustained CT footprint, counter-terror footprint for some period of time, but that doesn't have to be a huge cost to the Army. I have felt for a long time, even when I was at U.S. Central Command, that we were overinvested in the CT mission, and not everything at U.S. Central Command is counterterrorism. I think that ripples all the way up through the entire intelligence enterprise, frankly, and that it's time to redirect more of our effort and energies towards great power competition. I think about lessons learned from the CT fight that I want to ensure we don't actually carry forward to other fights. You know, that adage, we're always ready to fight the last war. I think by, with, and through is definitely the way to approach most of these kinds of missions. And we are not heavily invested in Africa, certainly in the way that the French are, which would be another example kind of along the lines of what General Hodges is saying, of relying on partners and allies to help with the burden. I don't think we walk away from it entirely. For one, the generation of refugees generates instability in regions that might cause us to come back in greater numbers in the future. And so I kind of think of it more like preventive medicine. If you brush your teeth, watch what you eat, exercise every week, there's a small cost, but it means you're not going to have the very expensive costs of something like a major ground war or even a major air war. So I don't think we can walk away from it entirely, but we need to sustain a light footprint. And some of those lessons learned of what do we not want to replicate in the future, in my mind, a lot of that is related to targeting, perhaps because, that's where I'd worked. So staring long at a target for 24 hours in advance to ensure there's not a children's school trip there the day before, that you're going to have collateral damage. That's not the kind of targeting we can afford to do on a broad scale. And I'm not suggesting that we no longer care about collateral damage. I'm just saying we need to find different ways of accomplishing those same things to minimize unnecessary suffering and ensure that we're striking targets in a humane way, but without the very resource-intensive way that we developed and prosecuted targets in the CT fight.
You said, when you pull troops out, you pull out capabilities. So what kind of in the intelligence world it's purposely dark for lots of, average Americans, but what can you say? What does the United States lose with all these drawdowns out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq, out of Syria, or when relations go south with the Turks, for example? We definitely don't have the same footprint in every aspect, including intelligence, as we had the last decade.
Well, I think, we sometimes underestimate or underutilize, or there's an underappreciation for the intelligence that allies can provide. Now I'll resist getting on another soapbox about, this culture of overclassification, but commanders should be interested in intelligence products from allies in the region. And, when I was at CENTCOM, I made sure to put some of that in front of General Botel so that he could say what the French are seeing on Syria, what some of our other allies are thinking about how a particular fight is going. So sometimes that sustained presence doesn't have to be expensive, but it is really, as much as anything, about sustaining relationships and understanding. I think when we look at the nations that we understand the least, nations like Iran or North Korea, it's very difficult for us to get a solid understanding, I think, at times of what's really happening within those nations. And I'm not suggesting we need to establish diplomatic relations with either of those countries. I just use those as extremes on the bookend of what happens when you have no relations with another country and you really don't understand what is happening there. So our sustained relationship with these countries doesn't need to be expensive, but they need to know that they can rely on us in an alliance, and that our policies towards them or the fight we're in isn't going to change on a whim.
All right, I want to turn to some of our questions that are coming in. As much as I would love to have a really big picture foreign policy dive with you three, I have to resist my own natural urges. We have some interesting ones. One is kind of brings the top to the bottom. Scott Vandewater writes, have our national leaders thrust a great power competition upon us, or have we just neglected great power competition as a focus and the leaders are refocusing us accordingly? I think that's a good question. We've had some writings on. Is it the right way to frame the world? Is it natural, or is this an artificial frame that's being forced on us incorrectly? Ben, yes.
So I do believe that great power competition prevents great power conflict, and that competition does not necessarily mean military. I mean, it's the full range of diplomatic efforts, information efforts. I'm here today in Cologne, but I was in Dusseldorf earlier. There are 1,700 different American businesses that have an office in Dusseldorf, but the Chinese have been in there and spent an incredible amount of money building relationships so that they can, in fact, have a foothold in Europe. And in Duisburg, which is kind of the terminal of the Belt Road Initiative, there are 100 trains a week coming from China that end up in this part of Germany. So this is competition, and instead of us wailing away on our allies saying you can't use Huawei 5G or we're going to do sanctions, we should be competing, working with Ericsson and Nokia, for example, and put money into it so that we're not threatening or cajoling allies, but instead we're competing. Same thing in the information space. So if we want to avoid conflict, we compete by having ready, determined forces with strong alliances and unleashing the talent of American business, and also maintaining these relationships. This is a small thing, but it's illustrative. Normally, there are 11,000 young Germans every year that are high school age, college age, that are in some kind of a fellowship or exchange program in the United States. 11,000 young Germans every year. There's 0 this year because these have all been cut or stopped due to the COVID. But this is part of the competition as well.
Kevin, if I could jump in here, I think that, let's just say if there were to be a Biden administration, you might have a different phrase from great power competition. You may have a different rhetorical and aesthetic description of it, but the basic thing is not a social construct. The fact is, folks usually date this to 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, the attention to the fact that Russia and China are a thing and should be the center of our focus. It probably goes back before that. I'm thinking of the invasion of Georgia in 2008. Should have gotten our attention a little sooner. So, Mattis in the National Defense Strategy said we have to see the world as it is, not as the way we want it to be. And you'll notice that some version of that phrase, I think, it's like the first sentence in Biden's foreign affairs piece from a couple of weeks or months ago. So if we see it as that, and I really hope that if there is a political transition to a Biden administration, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we really retain the focus on what is, after all, the pacing threat.
There's a more specific question, Tom. It's probably right for you too. How much of a role will the Army have in a kinetic war with China in the South China Sea? Boy, that's real specific. So with China in the sea, what's the Army's role?
So I would point to what General McConville said, that you got out of General McConville on the last panel in terms of distributed fires. And so there's lots of islands in the Pacific. And if we really take the NDS injunction of strategically predictable and operationally unpredictable, that means doing things different. That means restructuring our battalions, frankly, and I think distributing things throughout that region. So spreading things out, all for the good, and putting them in lots of different places, I think is part of it.
General Gibson, I see some nodding from you.
I just wanted to build on the great power competition aspect. Is it real or is it thrust on us? I absolutely think it's real, and competition is a key word, as General Hodges said. I think we have to resist looking at this as a new incarnation of the Cold War, looking at it in a binary nature, as that was US and NATO versus USSR and Warsaw Pact. It's absolutely not binary, not only because there aren't just two players, but it's also not this hot Cold War. It is a spectrum from cooperation, frankly, competition, and then conflict. And ideally, we keep things within the cooperation and competition side of the spectrum. But there are areas where we need to cooperate, even with Russia, China, and any of our adversaries. Things like this pandemic that we're going through, the next pandemic, whenever that occurs, climate change. There are areas where we have to cooperate. You even look until recently when SpaceX had their sent men into space. We've been reliant on Russia for getting folks to the International Space Center. That is an area of cooperation. And so the final piece I'd say on this, I think, is that this competition with great powers is not predominantly military, nor should it be. It is these other elements of power, increasingly economic, information, influence, backstopped perhaps by military power. But we need to be careful, I think, as viewing great power competition as a China version of the Soviet Cold War.
Kevin, if I could also say, there's 100,000 U.S. Army soldiers that wake up smelling the Pacific every morning, from Hawaii, Alaska, Fort Lewis, out to Korea, Japan. The Army provides logistics. The Army provides a lot of space teams, a lot of intelligence support, communications infrastructure, all the stuff that's necessary for sustained combat in the Pacific region. So, that doesn't mean that we're going to be the ones in the lead role, but the lead role doesn't happen without the Army's contribution to it, and obviously air defense. I mean, that's THAAD and Patriot out there that's protecting everybody, not just Army units.
Yeah, I think folks don't realize how much the Army is prepared for Asia conflict and what they do at least at places like Joint Base Lewis McChord, because it's just not sometimes matched. What they do doesn't match the news of the day that has to get covered in some sense as well. We're in our last 4 minutes, and I wanted to kind of go back a little bit to the beginning of what we were talking about, which is how Americans are feeling about the service in the force, and especially you, General Gibson. For those of you watching, if you didn't know, we had an interesting article in Defense One a couple months back about women in intelligence, and how the intelligence world in the military is one where there's actually quite a few women in senior ranks, more than in other fields, for lots of reasons, history and rules and combat, etc. But it comes at a time too where there are lots of issues of sexual harassment still in the news. Some tragedies at Fort Hood that have been happening. Senators who are still keeping the Army's feet to the fire. General Gibson, as one of the senior most women to come out of the Army recently, do you see positive trends, negative trends, worrying trends? What's your message for folks on these issues?
I do not see worrying trends. I wrote an op-ed in a course years ago when my daughter was joining the Army that said, I'm far more worried about sexual assault on her college campus than in a military unit where she has caring, trusted leadership. Does sexual assault occur in the military? Yes. It occurs in society. And I think the ability to identify and redress it in the military is much stronger than occurs or is available to most women in society or college campuses or in the workplace. So I do not think we have negative trends in that regard. I think the military, back to your question about how the American people view the military, I think it's important for all sectors of society to contribute to the military force to the extent possible. You know, clearly there are Americans whose criminal background, drug use, you know, physical health will prevent them from serving in the military. But, you know, for me, growing up in Montana, which is an incredibly homogenous state, the exposure to people from different parts of the country, to different races, different ethnicities, different religious beliefs was incredibly powerful. And I've seen that for military members in all of my formations who come from small towns, big towns, who've never been around other Americans in the way that they are in the military. I think it can be something that kind of knits us together as a society. And I think it's very important for us to preserve that respect for the military and indeed our apolitical nature.
Last thoughts. We're at our final minute. Ben, Tom?
Thanks, Kevin. Number one, the Army has got to change these base names. Bases named after Confederate generals makes no sense. I'm embarrassed. I was so late in my career before I even realized I started thinking what this is about. It's indefensible. There's no point in trying to defend it. That needs to change immediately. Number two, we have got to emphasize respect the vote, respect the outcome. That needs to be a message from everybody, every leader. The fact that people are even wondering what might happen is a worrying thing. So every leader should talk about everybody should vote, everybody should respect the vote. And finally, the United States should lead, not leave.
And
Go ahead, Tom.
I would just say real briefly, both in terms of kind of the strike bucket and the air defense bucket, that new concepts and imaginative concepts for organization, for lower manning requirements and greater distribution, I think is going to help out in a big way.
And Karen, any other on your own topics, final thoughts?
No, I loved the way that General Hodges ended that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's an endorsement then for everything General Hodges says. Good.
All of the above. Yes. I am active in the League of Women Voters, so I encourage folks to vote. Yes.
Very good. Very good. And I can't believe General Hodges didn't mix in a Florida State reference here. So I'm both proud and disappointed at the same time. Listen, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. Thank you for taking that trip around the world and these issues with us. It's tricky times for the military and American politics and American public life and in global life, and who knows what the next few months will bring us. So to our audience, thank you as well. I want to remind everyone to join us for our future series episodes coming up for State of Defense. We have the next one, September 22nd, 2 p.m., the State of the Air Force, with the keynote interview with General C.Q. Brown, the new Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who's becoming an American, I think, public figure very quickly right now. And for the three of you, again, thank you for joining us, for giving us your time, and enjoy the rest of the COVID year best you can.